We're on.
Right. Our next witness is William Sargent.
Yeah. Members of the committee, I'd like to thank you for the opportunity to testify in front of you. I consider it both an honor and an opportunity to present the views of the average Vermont outdoorsman or outdoor person. To quickly summarize, I'm a native Vermonter, originally from Worcester, just north of here. Went to Montpelier High School and lived in Shaftesbury since 1979. I graduated from the University of Vermont School of Forestry in 74. Packed my car up and had my job down in Shaftesbury or around southern Vermont. As of May, I will have made my living for 50 continuous years working in the outdoors. I'm still working with my son running a small log and timber marketing business called Hollow Hill Forestry. When I graduated from forestry school in 74, I couldn't have dreamed that I'd have such an intense and rewarding career working outdoors. Never worked behind a desk. I call myself a dirt forester. Adding to my experience, I also worked for 10 years as a Vermont deputy game warden. Late 70s, early 80s. No radios. Sometimes the only person other than a state trooper on duty in Bennington County. Those 10 years are full of good stories and real hands-on experience with people and wildlife of all kinds. One thing I did learn, and I thought I might share with you, in your rush to finish up the legislation, don't pass laws that the average game warden can't enforce. And there's a lot of them on the books right now. It seems, and also pass laws that the average person can understand. The fishing game book used to be about that big. Now it's huge. I can read and write, and I have to study it before I go out fishing to a particular lake to make sure I'm following the right regulations. And these laws need to be straightforward and easy to understand. I'm not a politician. This testimony is out of my comfort zone, but I had to get involved with this issue. It's small and trivial compared to the other issues you legislators are dealing with. Education, immigration, women's health issues, just to name a few. The Senate has already dealt with several of my objections to this legislation. They dropped the trapping changes. I certainly can't object to several non-outdoorsmen and women from being included on the board. These would be the non-consumptive users that you've all heard about the last few weeks. To quote a Mr. Rodney Elmer, who wrote in an online group, which I've commented in several times, real wildlife governance with every part of nature and humanity in mind would never be exclusive of anyone. I agree with it. In 1976, I was coon hunting with dogs in Powell when I saw my first opossum. They didn't belong in Vermont. I never studied opossum at UVM forestry school or wildlife classes that I took. A few years later, my red-bone pet I was talking about died of heartworm, first known case in Bennington County. He traveled with me every day in the woods all around. Ticks have shown up. They're in constant danger. I find I pick them off myself all the time. I've been tested, I've been vaccinated. I know a lot of other foresters that have. Or my chronic wasting disease is another thing that's right on our doorstep. What have we done? Are we prepared for it? Despite our best efforts, emerald ash borer will all but wipe out the ash tree in Vermont. It's going to happen. I see it every day in the woods. I see where I'm going with these examples. Global warming wasn't heard of when I graduated from UVM, but I felt the changes coming early in my career. I didn't know what or recognize it at the time, but I felt it in the outdoors and my surroundings. The opossum was moving from south, moving north, and that's why I saw it in Pownell, Vermont. It's all over the state now. They continue to work their way north. Ticks were coming out of Connecticut. My dog had been to Connecticut with me, and now they're all over southern Vermont. I mean, my wife walks out in the flower beds and she picks ticks off of herself. My dog, I got another big red-bone dog, same thing. There are more changes to come. I'll go to my objections on this bill instead of all this background. Coyote hunting with dogs mustn't be abolished. The legislature charged the department and the board with rewriting the legislation concerning coyote hunting. They did it. I wasn't crazy about the changes, but the department and the board did their work, and so be it. This coyote hunting is a regulatory matter, not a law type matter. That's my belief. The courts found the department and the board had done their job. This is the way our system in Vermont works. The history of the accomplishments in the board and the department is well documented. Let them do their jobs. Give the changes that they've already made concerning the regulations. Give them a couple seasons to work. I see these changes leading, and I'm going to back up. Coyote hunting is this many people with dogs. It's tiny. I see it leading to a bigger problem. Bear are hunted the same way in the state of Vermont, and there's a lot of bear hunters out there, and they're going to take this. This is a big problem to them. I've been on a lot of bear hunts myself. Never taken a bear. Don't care to, but I go for the fun of listening to the dogs, and that's what most of the bear hunters I've been with go for, the fun of listening to the dogs. My second and biggest objection is a little more complex. Our forefathers set up a system of checks and balances in every branch of the government. The board is not, nor it should ever be, a strictly advisory board. If the board becomes strictly advisory, this is the last time we can truly say that the average person has a say in writing regulations. The board is made up of average people that have a deep understanding of the outdoors. Many have many years of experience. I suspect this understanding will take more than a few classes for folks with no outdoor background to understand. I think it's great that a couple people be included. I have no problem with it, but it'll take them some time to get their feet on the ground. The board currently has the power to override the commissioner if they don't feel a proposed regulation is in the best interest of their constituents, the wildlife, and the state. If the legislature doesn't like it, they have the power to step forward and change it. Excuse me while I pry my pages apart. Well, the system of checks and balances worked well since the 60s, when the board was first, under several names, was formed. The commissioner and the board negotiate and work out their differences. We move forward. If regulations need to be changed, they are revisited. It's happened many times. The system of checks and balances works. Don't change it. The current setup of the board, this is really important, the way it's set up now, helps bridge administrative changes. Without that system of checks and balances, the continuity of management, if an administration changes, is lost. It's no different than me managing a woodlot and it changes landowners. You lose that continuity of management. And the board and the department have done a tremendous job, and we have a system that has a nice flow. They change regulations. Deer herd's a prime example. But thank you again for the opportunity to present my views to the committee. Please don't rush to push legislation through as you come to the end of your session. Give it time and think about it. It's the Vermont way. Thanks again, everybody. Appreciate it.
Your testimony, do members have questions?
Questions? Talk about dogs, red bones? Appreciate it. Thanks very much.
Thank you. All right, next up, we have Michelle Lute joining us from via Zoom.
Hello, everybody. I'm going to share my screen now. How's that? Can you see my slides?
Again,
Great. All right. Thank you, Chair Sheldon and Environment and Energy Committee members for allowing me to speak today. My organization, Wildlife for All, enthusiastically supports S258, which shares a mission with my organization in reforming the governance of wildlife management to be more equitable, just, and democratic. I speak to you today on behalf of our organization's Vermont members and supporters. I also speak to you today as the daughter of 4 generations of American farmers and a person with degrees in ecology and animal behavior and a PhD in wildlife management. I also have 2 decades of experience in wildlife conservation, science, and policy. My organization recognizes this legislation as a crucial step towards ensuring that our wildlife management policies are equitable and reflective of the values of all Vermonters. S258 is needed because there currently exists a gap between the public's values for wildlife and the regarding wildlife management. Similar to the national context, Vermonters believe wildlife are integral members of a broad community of life and that we should strive to live in harmony with wildlife. And yet, the Vermont Fish and Wildlife Board allows practices such as hounding and hunting coyotes over bait, which are not only inhumane and unsupported by diverse publics, but also run counter to principles of ethical wildlife management. Other examples include the numerous petitions that they've failed to fairly consider, including a closed regulated coyote hunting season to avoid the breeding season, as well as a prohibition on hunting mother bears with cubs in sight. Such common sense regulations are a given for the species valued by hunters. Across the country, where this gap exists, we see governance processes mired in controversy. While debate is a healthy component of democracy, the level of conflict we're seeing is decidedly not. Contentious wildlife policies are revisited over and over and then even litigated. When the Vermont Fish and Wildlife Board fails to engage in democratic process and fails to listen to diverse constituents, the onus then falls on you, the legislature, to reconsider wildlife policy. Not only is there a gap between current policy and public values, but there is also a gap between current policy and conservation science, which points to alarming rates of extinction and declines of once abundant species. Vermont is by no means immune to this crisis, and your own state wildlife action plan admits that, quote, keeping wildlife populations healthy offers a host of benefits, healthier ecosystems upon which we all depend, more wildlife to enjoy, and fewer species on the brink of extirpation mean less need for regulatory restrictions, end quote. The plan then enumerates some of the many threats facing Vermont's wildlife, which are included in the quote here on my slide. They range from habitat loss, fragmentation, and degradation to climate change, which has already been mentioned. The plan goes on to explain that Vermont's species of greatest conservation need include 134 amphibians and reptiles, birds, fishes, invertebrates, and mammals, and 198 invertebrate species. For plants, it's 648 species of an estimated 1,500 total vascular and non-vascular species that were selected to be species of greatest conservation need. That's a lot of species. And yet the board spends most of their time funding and considering the few species of interest to hunters, trappers, and anglers, such as deer, who flourish in human-impacted landscapes and are in need of much less attention. On the other hand, moose and fisher are struggling in Vermont, perhaps related to high rates of rodenticide that we're seeing in tested specimens. But both of those species still have hunting and trapping seasons, respectively. The board also sets policies that are completely out of line with the growing body of evidence regarding the most up-to-date best practices in wildlife management. The board allows liberalized hunting of carnivores like coyotes, despite the fact that they are integral members of wild native biological communities. Coyotes, for instance, have outsized benefits across ecosystems, regulating smaller mesocarnivores, keeping prey species healthy, and ultimately increasing biodiversity overall. At the bequest of hunters, the board allows baiting, which not only violates any sense of fair chase among the hunting community, but also can spread disease and habituate animals to human sources of food, which increases the likelihood of human-wildlife conflict. And I want to make a note about, the actual likelihood of conflict is often exaggerated. Even the USDA's reporting shows that it's fractions of a percent of livestock losses from predators. Furthermore, conflict would be even lower if we restricted hunting of carnivores and allowed stable social structures to self-regulate population dynamics. Conflict would be lower still if we focused on efforts on what works, namely preventing conflict before it occurs through various methods. And I'm happy to discuss that, but that might be beyond the scope of this presentation. So while we're witnessing alarming biodiversity loss and hearing from Vermonters and Americans across the country that they hold diverse values for thriving wildlife, the Vermont Fish and Wildlife Board insists on setting regulations that serve the preferences of a singular minority interest group, and importantly, are using a good chunk of general funds to do so. In the governance literature, this situation is what's referred to as tyranny of the minority. In states across the country, we see diverse constituents growing weary of this tyranny and finding alternative avenues of democratic participation. That might mean going to the legislature for each species or topic of concern. It might also mean petitions, ballot measures where allowed, entrenched conflict among groups, and countermeasures from defenders of the status quo. This slows down effective democratic process in a time when we need to adapt quickly to changing conditions. This also erodes trust in government institutions and decreases our ability to cooperate. And I'm sure I don't have to tell you that our country is in an all-time low for cooperation right now. So I painted a sort of grim picture, but that's where S258 comes in. By making the Fish and Wildlife Board advisory only, the bill aims to amend the current structure that allows for disproportionate influence from defenders of the status quo, thereby fostering a more inclusive and democratic decision-making process. And let me just elaborate very quickly on this final point. One of the most significant aspects of S258 is its recognition of the public trust doctrine, which asserts that natural resources and wildlife are held in trust by the government for the benefit of all citizens. This is a legal doctrine that has its origins in English common law and has been upheld by U.S. courts over the years. As applied to wildlife, it means that wild animals don't belong to anyone. All wild species are part of a public trust, not just those species of interest to consumptive users. Everybody benefits from wildlife and healthy ecosystems, so we are all beneficiaries of the trust. The government is the trustee, of course. In the case of wildlife, this includes U.S. state legislators as well as state wildlife boards. Trustees have a duty to manage the trust for all beneficiaries, including those yet to be born, as well as wild nature generally. Responsible trust management requires that trustees make an effort to understand, consider, and balance the full range of public views on wildlife. This is where the Vermont board is failing at democratic governance. We are particularly heartened by the provisions in S258 that aim to diversify the membership of the Fish and Wildlife Board, ensuring representation for all beneficiaries of the public trust. 8 states have boards or commissions that are only advisory. That's Alabama, Delaware, Illinois, Maine, Maryland, North and South Dakota, West Virginia, and New York. 3 states don't even have wildlife commissions. Those are Minnesota, Connecticut, and Rhode Island. The number of states enacting new requirements for greater diverse and representation on their boards is growing. Wildlife management should not be monopolized by a single interest group, but should instead incorporate the perspectives and priorities of all citizens. History has taught us that expanding the voices at the decision-making table serves to strengthen our democracy. It does not take away others' established rights, as you may hear opponents of the bill argue. When women gained the right to vote, men didn't lose it. No one lost their rights when the Emancipation Proclamation was signed. Finally, the establishment of training for board members on critical issues such as ethics, climate change impacts on wildlife, and human-wildlife conflict resolution is a commendable effort to ensure that decisions are informed by the latest scientific knowledge and best practices in conservation. In conclusion, we urge you to support S258 and work towards its swift passage. By enacting these reforms, Vermont can lead the way in establishing a wildlife management framework that is just, democratic, and reflective of diverse interests and values of our citizens. The policy set by such a process will be much more durable and effective in the short and long terms. Thank you so much for your time and consideration.
Thank you for your testimony. Do members have questions? Not seeing any. Thank you for joining us today. Next up, we have Trevor Bunnell.
Well, I'm here to talk to you about opposing S258. As you can see, there's a lot of outside interest groups.
I hate to interrupt you, but for the record, if you could just say your name and
Trevor Arnold, Danville, Vermont, father of 3 young men. I'm here to oppose 258. I don't feel there's anything beneficial to come from this. The board has done extremely well. Good job. I'd like to see where they failed. If anybody could tell me that at the end, I'd love to know. And I'm going to say this. The people saying their voice isn't heard. I went to the meetings, most of the same people always there. Same side, not same side. I see a lot of outside money interest groups wanting to dictate what's going to go on in Vermont. And that concerns me as a father, a landowner. I believe in landowners' rights. My family owns 1,000 acres immediate, my brother, myself, and my dad. I'm highly concerned where this board, if you guys break down a board, if everything in Vermont worked as well as that did in this government we're sitting at right now, we'd be in a much better place. We're trying to fix something that's not broken. And I'm not saying anything as anything is perfect, but when it came to the coyote hounding, which I am a hounder, I do want to say that, there was a landowner issue going on, and that's what was supposed to be addressed. As soon as that was addressed, it was no longer good enough. And let's be honest, let's get real. We're here today because a certain group did not get what they wanted. We gave up. I shouldn't say we gave up, because I actually believe in those rules they did. I think I'm glad they're implemented, because I do believe in landowners' rights. Like I said, 1,000 acres. If you don't want me on your property, I shouldn't be on your property, just like any time of hunting. That's your right as a Vermonter. And I do believe that. I don't care if you lived here 1 year, if you lived there 100 years. But that being said, they made tough laws, and those are tough laws. If I go on your property, I get a warning. Second time, I get a fine. Third time, I'll lose my license. Those laws worked, and I can prove it. There was not one complaint by a landowner this year. Those are tough laws. That's an amazing turnaround from what was going on before. So for us to get erased and not given a chance to prove that we are ethical and humane, and I know everybody's values are different. Mine come from my grandparents. I know that that's where I learned mine. And I can tell you this, I get we're not all the same, but do I feel that I'm barbaric when I'm hunting coyotes? No. I've heard all this story about being 2 miles from my dogs, can't control them. That's all been proven myth, because guess what? We didn't have one landowner complaint this whole year. Another thing is economics in this state. This is frustrating. I'm blue collar. I work hard. I pay my taxes. And I feel like that's all I'm allowed to do right now. And I just don't, I can't wrap my head around that. I should have more rights in that, and especially if I'm not bailing. I live between 3 farms. I hunt coyotes there quite often, and they call me to ask me to run. The last day we ran the season, I actually got a call from Sutton. A guy had a coyote in his barn attacking his calves that morning. So I came up and I ran there. I did not get the coyote. But I definitely chased the coyote off and made it wild again. Hopefully it won't be back in his barn for a while. But I can tell you the Pattersons, McReynolds, they appreciate what we do there. I think we provide a service there that I must, because otherwise they wouldn't be asking me. Patterson's, I don't like running at Patterson's farm. It's not, there's a couple neighbors that don't really care for me, and I've never had any problem with it, but I know where their stance is, so I don't want to ever have a conflict with those people. But Patterson's plow a mile-long road in North Danville, which is very snowy. They have to plow it every day, just hoping that I'm going to come run the coyotes here for them. I don't go there often. Like I said, though, economically, we just fought for two years. We had to come together to come up with these rules that did work, and we're already back on the chopping block. How is that fiscally responsible for those for the citizens of Vermont? I think we owe it to them to see if these rules work. And if they need tweaking in the future, yes. Another thing is to hide it on the back half of this 258 bill is crazy. We just went through that. But so if you make any changes to 258, I'm going to get erased. My family's going to get erased. I don't believe in that. And I can tell you this, I'm not the only person. 4th generation on the farm we live on right now. My grandparents, my great-grandparents, they all had hounds of some sort or another. I can tell you right now, my roots are deep, and I get it. I get everybody's got to work together, but I'm here and be more tolerant of other people, but nobody wants to be tolerant of us. And this board, it's just going to be a fight. Let's be honest. Can it be better? Maybe, but it is pretty smooth. And if you tweak that board, I feel like there's just going to be more battling. Because like he said, I heard earlier, spokes in the wheel. And the other day I sat in here and a guy talked about building bridges, said it 3 times about building bridges. How do you build bridges by canceling somebody on the way? That's not building any bridges. There's no bridges he wants to build. That's burning bridges. I'm sorry. If you want to really build bridges, you wouldn't cancel anybody trying to make it better. And then I think that's pretty easy to see. And like I said, too, I got a 4th generation, and I'm not the only one. There's a lot of Northern Vermonters I talk to. And I mean that. I'm very avid to talking to people about this, trying to inform them what's going on over here. And there's a lot of frustration. There's a lot of frustration, not just about this, but the way we're going. You take this pride away from these rural Vermonters, that pride in hunting and fishing, and say we lose more lives in the way because this board actually doesn't move in the right direction, we move the wrong direction. You're going to less avenues for the next generation, means more drug problems, more everything. I mean, you take this away from these people, strip them their pride. and see what you get. I mean that. You won't get it from us. We're honestly, if this board goes through, I'm thinking about moving. And I'm not just saying that, I'm not threatening. I've had this talk with my wife for about 4 months now. We've been literally contemplating leaving, and that's hard for me. We're on my family's land. But I will think about where I want my kids to be raised. And right now, I look around these towns and these cities around here, and this is not looking like the same Vermont that I was so proud of when I went to college. And I would be down there to a fault. My friends would tell you that you were way too proud of where you live. And I mean that. That I did. I talked about home all the time. This was a great place to be raised. I don't know if this is the same as it was when I was a kid. And the direction this is going is definitely not helping. I'm asking you guys to really think this out and try not to fix what's not broken. And as far as hounding, like I said before, I'm not barbaric. I would much rather see my sons out on snowshoes or on their snowmobiles, following their hound dogs through the woods on a Saturday morning, cold Saturday morning in the winter, than playing video games all day. And I mean that. That's the truest statement I can tell you. I'm worried about the next generation. I don't want to just go to work, pay my taxes. I want to keep my liberties. And I'm asking you guys, please don't do anything hasty. And that bill should not be attached to that bill. They should be two separate orders. They're too big of deals to try to slide that through. So anybody have any questions for me?
Thank you for your testimony and joining us today.
Say that again.
Thank you for your testimony and for joining us today.
Yeah, of course.
Do members have questions? Representative, I haven't called on anyone today. Logan,
Thank you.
go.
On the first half of the bill regarding the change in governance for the Fish and Wildlife Board, what specific objections would you have to adding folks with an interest in wildlife who aren't hunters, fishers, or trappers?
Thank you for asking that, because I'm not a professional speaker. It's really out of my comfort zone. I'm glad you asked me that, because like I said, throwing a spoke in the wheel, that's the easy way of saying it. But let's be honest, with anti-hunting group does not care about conservation. Again, preservation and conservation, they sound a lot alike, but there is no conservation in anti-hunting. If you are anti-hunter, do not honestly have conservation in your mix. It doesn't exist. I think they believe it does, but if you're not managing one herd, and let's be honest, we want to pretend that we're not part of this ecosystem. We are part of the ecosystem. We're the biggest part of this ecosystem. And all this town right here, this is a deer yard. Let's be honest. Every river, everything was built in the rivers, the deer yard. The coyotes, I'm in the woods as much as anybody. And I can say this, I've seen where deer are getting taken down. I've walked up on deer. They get eaten from the rear end alive. And that is, I've come on, I shed hunt. I've looked for moose horns. I trained my dogs. I can tell you this right now, that if you're going to control one species and you're going to manage one species, you have to manage the predator species also. I can tell you that I've seen coyotes. I've found coyotes when I'm shed hunting, curled up in a ball, fell asleep, and never woke up again. That's starvation. I spend a lot of time in the woods. That's where I choose to recreate. I've got 1,000 miles on snowshoes. When I say thousands, I got 3 knee surgeries, and I picked up 1,000 moose horns that fall off in the winter. I'm very avid to be out there. Every minute I get, I'm outside. And I can honestly say that we should not also confuse intelligence with education. Some of the people that have their feet on the ground know as much as anybody. And I would like to prove that also is when the whole moose population thing came about, I was finding dead moose everywhere. I was the first person to ever take it to Cedric Alexander, which used to be your moose biologist. And I told Cedric, you have a problem here. The moose are dying. And at first he actually discarded what I had to say. A year later, Cedric called me and said, Trevor, can you start documenting where you find these moose? We do have a problem. But it took a year. But I was the guy on the ground that pointed it out to Cedric. And then New Hampshire brought it up too. So, but back then, I just don't think it will be smooth. There's no conservation. And look at the fight just for the coyote laws to make sensible laws. That took 2 years. You're going to see a lot of fights like that. We want things to move swiftly. And at times you do need to move swiftly. I believe in the board. I don't think they failed in many ways. I don't think there's a reason to say that this board has failed where we want to throw a stick in the spoke, because honestly, the stick in this boat could be catastrophic. It may not be seeming at first, but why would we want to take a chance for something that's working so smoothly when we have a lot of things in the state to be working on right now? Thank you so much for your time. I appreciate it. And please don't erase my family. Thank you.
And next we have Alex Smith.
Thanks for having me, guys. So my name is Alex Smith. I'm a resident of Bristol. Before I start here, I want to just state that I'm a member of a variety of different, groups in the hunting and conservation space, but BHA, the Sporting Lead Free, my local conservation commission, so on and so forth. But I want to be very clear that I'm speaking as Alex Smith. These are my thoughts. I'm not trying to represent these larger groups. I do urge you to consider the testimony of groups like Backcountry Hunters and Anglers that have already been submitted as written testimony as well. There's very, very well educated and well spoken people there that have submitted testimony to you. I'm speaking to you as a hunter, a fisherman, an advocate for wildlife and wild spaces, and a father of 2 young children who I hope will have the opportunity to be strong stewards of natural landscapes as I do. Though I have spoken in support of several principles that underlie S258, and some of the reasons that exist are valid and they need to be addressed. But there are also some significant issues with the bill that I have that I do not support it. However, I'm worried that this bill's passage is likely, and I do not want to miss the chance to lobby for amendments that would make it more palatable to me and my peers in the hunting community. I will lay those out below. First, I want to sort of state a word on the good of all this. This process, exhausting though it has been truly exhausting and generally miserable for everybody involved, I think. It's led me to ongoing conversations with several people in the animal welfare community in effort to find places where our values overlap. These conversations have been difficult. They've been uncomfortable. We have basic fundamental differences in the way that we view our place in nature. However, we all do share love for many of the same things, and I think we owe it to wildlife, wild places, and future generations to look for common ground where we can find it. What's more, if we refuse to engage, we forfeit the chance to tell our side of the story about hunting and help craft the narrative, leaving that role instead to social media and online videos, which are incapable of demonstrating context and nuance and often portray only the worst of us. I feel that on some level, S258 is a legislative response to interpersonal problems, not just between advocates and the board, but between hunters and non-hunters, and striving to have a more trusting relationship between these groups is an important part of the process. I understand their frustration over what they perceive as stonewalling by the hunting community, and I acknowledge that there's truth to it at times. We've gotten so fearful of incremental losses to hunting rights, leading to wholesale erosion of them, that we're unwilling to hear anything these people are saying, regardless of whether it has merit. I refer to arguments over killing sows with cubs, live action trail cameras, and wanton waste as examples of this. I'm not pointing fingers at the board or anyone else here. I've been as guilty as anyone. My ability to hunt and fish, to live what I feel to be the most natural and human lives that I can, means so much to me that I cannot stomach the idea of losing it, and my kids in turn losing it. Hunting is far more than recreation to me, a somewhat belittling term that I hear thrown around a lot. It's not golf. Nothing against golf, but I kind of got something against golf, but it's not playing video games. It's my life. It's how I feed my family. It's how I feel closest to the natural world. It's how I've come to feel as at home in the woods and in the water as I do in my kitchen. I've also recently become licensed as a guide in New York, so it will be part of my livelihood hopefully at some point here. Anything that takes a step in the direction of losing it is extremely frightening to me, and it makes me want to dig in my heels and fight back with all I've got. I challenge anyone with a passion like that to consider what it would feel like to think that there are folks out there who desire to take it away from you, and what's more, who think the thing that you love is mean-spirited and unethical. It hurts, it's scary, and it makes me extremely wary of the task of being regulating hunting being done by individuals who may wish it didn't exist in the first place. However, we cannot be so fearful that we reject reasonable ideas for fear of a slippery slope. That's not the way forwards for us as conservationists, and it's not the way forward as members of society. I say this to make the point that I hope we will all learn from this process that we need to be more willing to engage with ideas on their own merit, rather than recoiling from them out of what fear may come next. However, there's one fundamental problem or hurdle towards productive conversations and relationships between hunters and the animal welfare community, and I hope that listeners in that world will take note of this. We, hunters, have no concrete sense of what the end goal of animal rights advocates is. I recognize that this may be nearly impossible to quantify and that explanations will vary from group to group or person to person, but I urge people in those positions to try. I've heard it spelled out in plenty of high-level philosophical ways, a more just world for animals, animals being more than just a resource, etc. But none of us know exactly what that means. Is a more just world one where coyote hunting happens in a structured season? If so, we can have a conversation about that. Is a more just world one that suggests human predation of wild animals is unnecessary in modern times? If so, I fundamentally disagree. Without a clear understanding of long-term goals, hunters will continue to assume the worst, and we will not be able to have productive relationships that center around the topics on which we agree: reduction of habitat degradation, mitigation of wildlife-human conflicts, encouraging transitions toward non-lead ammunition, things like this. There are overlaps here, and there are places that we can focus on. While S258 does good things, the emphasis on open-mindedness, the proposed trainings for board members, that's the big one. That's one of my favorite elements of it. It's just as it's been discussed and by many of the presenters today, everything's changing, and continuing education and training our board members to be their best selves in face of ongoing conflicts and climate change and so on is critical. Well, it does good things. My concern is that in an effort to honor a broader spectrum of user groups and focus on science-based management, it fails to explicitly acknowledge and thus direct the board to acknowledge the deep cultural, recreational, and public health values, both mental and physical, of a consumptive relationship with nature. I urge you to consider the testimony of Dr. Meredith Niles on this particular subject. I know that she submitted the other day. She's been studying the impacts of self-reliance on food security and health and can speak professionally on the deep benefits of this lifestyle, particularly for Vermonters of below median income levels. An attempt to reduce wildlife management to something science-based has been called on by both sides of this issue, and the sentiment is reflected in this bill. I agree, as we all do, that sound, impartial science needs to be the first criterion considering things like bag limits, methods of take, and season dates. But the value of hunting to the community that engages in it is far less easily quantified in that way. For example, me shooting a wood duck off Bristol Pond is of no ecological benefit to anyone or anything but myself, my family, and whoever's around when I pull it out of the smoker. Ecologically speaking, all there is that as a result of my action is one less wood duck flying around, which, if from that standpoint, is a net negative. However, it provided me and my family with nourishment. It led me outdoors into a beautiful place, and it taught me more about the ways of the species. That value cannot be ignored and must be considered by any board that seeks to regulate these activities alongside the tangible ecological criteria. Moreover, the engagement of the hunting community is not only critical to our quality of life, but also for funding the department and all the work it does for hunted and non-hunted species. Democratically allocated access to sustainable utilization of wild animals is the backbone of the North American model of wildlife conservation. And that continued opportunity is critical not only for funding our desperately needed conservation efforts, but also for engaging future generations with nature, continuing to create advocates for wild spaces and closeness to the land. I'm an environmentalist. I'm a conservationist. I'm an advocate for public land and wilderness. I have a 4-year-old who picks up litter if he sees it in the woods without being asked to do so. And we got to those things through hunting. It's not only the only avenue you can take to get to being a good steward of nature, but it's a huge one. And in this day and age, we should not want to close those doors. I think it's important as well to acknowledge the role of the board and the reason for its necessity and composition. I find myself quite regularly talking about hunting with folks who do not engage in it. I meet a lot of new people through my job as a tile contractor and in home renovations. I'm a bit of a chatterbox, and I'm constantly thinking about hunting, so this stuff comes up. Through this, I'm often reminded of just how different the picture in people's heads is from what really plays out in the woods. Sometimes it's more glamorous, honestly, sometimes less so. Hunting is nuanced and complicated in every way, from the reasons we engage in it and through the way events unfold to the techniques and traditions behind our methods. And for this reason, it's incredibly important that there is significant input in the rulemaking process from citizens with a long-standing personal experience in the field, and a starting point assumption that hunting is our state's primary management tool, and that if an animal is significantly abundant, it can be harvested and utilized. I see this as a basic human right, and I see one that is backed by the state's constitution. I personally take no issue with those people handing over the final say in rulemaking authority to those areas whose area of expertise is ecology of the animal in question. But the hunter's lived experience is a critical component of the process, and it cannot be replaced by theoretical knowledge. Now, I have some proposed amendments. Hope you guys don't have anything to do for the next 6 months or so. I propose that section 4041 subsection D be amended to read: The board shall consider whether a proposed rule is designed to maintain the best health, population, viewing, and utilization levels while weighing alongside these factors the cultural, traditional, and public health values of hunting, fishing, trapping the species in question. For those of us that fear that S-258 constitutes an attack on hunting rights, it would go a long way to clearly direct the board to provide hunting opportunities unless it fails to be ecologically sustainable. This is the crux of my fear about the bill, that it does not adequately recognize this importance. List hunting, fishing, and trapping as a primary management tool of the department. I also propose that the bill establish a focus group to explore additional pathways to funding the Fish and Wildlife Department, such as the backpack tax, which would be a excise tax similar to Pittman Robertson and Dingell Johnson. We all acknowledge the precarious state of funding via the traditional streams of largely hunting and fishing related revenue, although I acknowledge that 26% or so comes from the general fund. And this bill proposes scope and procedural changes that will cost the additional resources. Eliminate the ban on certain coyote hunting techniques. Much of the conversation driving S-258 is centered around giving regulatory power to the department, which is something I can get behind. If that is the goal, it's hard for me to understand rules also being made through the legislature, who cannot be expected to be subject matter experts. If we were to depoliticize these decisions, they must be made by the biologists. However, this is my chance to pick off everybody on both sides of this issue. However, replace the ban on hounding and baiting coyotes with a directive to the department to periodically evaluate the status of coyotes and other non-native species and determine whether or not they have achieved a status in their ecosystem that suggests they should be treated as any other native game animal, with the fair chase concepts, season dates, bag limits, etc., that come with that. I acknowledge this is a complicated question, but I do think a reasonable conversation could be had about whether or not treating them as a nuisance to be eliminated from the landscape is A, productive, and B, adequately acknowledging and respecting their place in the ecosystem where they serve to fill a void left by predators we extirpated. Killing coyotes in large numbers at warm times of the year when their fur is worthless is not the management of a natural resource. It's a war on a nuisance. And there is a place for that in agricultural depredation settings, and there should be a system in place for those conflicts to be handled by the people that need to do so. But on a wholesale, state level, I think that it is very worth, and not just with coyotes, but we did this with smallmouth bass, for instance. This is an animal that came into the ecosystem, caused quite a ruckus, is here at this point, it has value to people, and we've acknowledged that it does serve a role. And it's, I think, periodic sort of checking in with species that do arrive on our landscape to decide whether or not they merit being treated as a native animal, I think is necessary. Finally, while I appreciate the amendment that requires Senate confirmation of candidates, I feel that returning the vast majority of appointing power to the governor, while it may benefit the hunting community in the short term, is a regression and will lead to a more partisan makeup of the board than if the task of appointing board members were split between multiple entities, perhaps the governor, secretary of state, natural resources committee, and the commissioner. As I stated in my testimony to the Senate, my greatest fear in all this is that it becomes overly politicized and partisan. As written, the bill also leaves an incredible amount of power to the commissioner, or the boss of the department, so to speak, a single governor-appointed entity. I don't have a perfect solution as to how to depoliticize that. Perhaps Senate confirmation of that commissioner as well, but I urge you to really strongly consider how much power that one individual has and how you can depoliticize that and make sure that doesn't become a political pinball that gets batted back and forth every few terms. I hope that there is a way for the good in this bill to be accomplished while continuing to honor and promote the deep and rich hunting and fishing tradition of this state, and without undue financial burden on the department. But it's a long ways from doing this, and I ask you, as my elected representatives, that if you must pass it, do not do so without rectifying the issues I've laid out above. This bill has been pitched as a way to represent the voices of more Vermonters, but has become a fight between hunters and the animal rights community, which are both relatively small percentages of Vermont's people. The overwhelming majority of Vermonters support hunting, deeply respect its cultural, traditional value, and recognize the importance that it has in feeding and connecting people with nature. They also want to see it done sustainably, with fair chase principles adhered to, and with the animal being utilized to its fullest potential. I ask the board and you guys, your North Star, when considering any changes to the way we regulate hunting, fishing, and trapping in the state of Vermont. In closing, if my family and I cannot live the life we love, hunting and fishing in the way that we so deeply believe in, we're out. And I don't mean that to sound melodramatic, but you can all tile your own shower. I'm going off. It's kind of a joke, but it does mean that much to us. I'm from the Adirondacks, but my sons are 8th generation Vermonters. My family's been in Bristol forever, my wife's family. And this is so important to us. And I acknowledge that, you know, it's just a goofy threat to make. But I think there's a lot of people like me for whom this way of life is just everything, and we can't live here without it. And I'm not talking about the like small, you know, things that are, you know, like this law here, this law there, but a general movement in the sentiment away from an acceptance of hunting and fishing being a part of how we interact with nature. We just can't live that way. And I completely acknowledge that there are people that don't feel the way that I do. And like I say, this process has brought me a lot closer to those people and to understanding their ways of looking at nature. And I think there's room for both of us. But I just want you to take that seriously and note that you know, the state of Vermont cannot be in a place of becoming less hospitable to its rural youth. And that sort of thing is part of why we're here and how we can stay here. And it's critical to us remaining around. Thank you very much for listening to all that.
Thank you for your testimony.
Yeah.
Representative Bongard.
Just to say, thank you. I think that was thoughtful testimony.
I appreciate it.
Put a lot of thought into it. Appreciate that.
I have hope for it.
I also think, by the way, if you could send that.
It is.
Yeah.
That'd be great.
Yeah.
Could you add some suggestions in there that? And I think your sort of notion of where the most Vermonters are on this issue is correct. I won't speak for the whole committee, but at least that's where, I think that's basically that's where we all are. And it is trying to sort out those points of conflict, let's say it's points of conflict in a way that is productive. That's what we're trying to do. So I appreciate your emphasis on trying to, I don't know what the right terminology is, but find common ground and think together about actual solutions rather than to forward.
I think it's the only way forward.
So I appreciate what you have to say.
I believe that we are sunk otherwise, frankly.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Have this same response to your testimony, openness to the nuance and the challenges of the conversations for all of us to have. So I appreciate that. Thanks.
Thank you.
Members, we have one additional joining us by Zoom today. Patrick Berry has joined us.
Okay, I'm probably not. Commit 54 football players. 1 minute. Baseball players are well to have the period.
Pat, are you with us?
Are you able to hear me?
Can hear you, yes.
Okay, I'd see if I can turn my video on. I am currently on the road, and I appreciate the opportunity to testify. So I'm assuming you'd like me just to jump right in?
Yes.
Okay, so I'm Patrick Berry. I'm the former commissioner of the Vermont Fish and Wildlife Department under Peter Shumlin. Currently served previously served on the Vermont Fish and Wildlife Board. Was previously the legislative and policy director for the Vermont Natural Resources Council. Also served on the Vermont Alliance of Conservation Voters, the Conservation Law Foundation Advisory Committee. And the reason I mention this is to make it clear that I don't feel like I come to this particular issue with some agenda-driven interest. My interest is focusing on good wildlife management. And to give you an idea of how I do come at this, when I was a legislative and policy director over 20 years ago for VNRC, I remember the biggest influence on me was John Tracy, who some of you may know. And he wasn't working on my issues, but I watched him working on a healthcare issue, and he didn't care where you lived or what party you were from. He was trying so diligently to do the most good for the most Vermonters. And my concern with this entire conversation is that it's serving an incredibly narrow interest. Now, currently, I'm the president and CEO of Backcountry Hunters and Anglers, and one of the reasons that I was drawn to this particular job is because the organization leads with conservation and collaboration, and very much recognizes that there are a lot of wildlife interests that can share these public resources, which is our focus: public lands, water, and wildlife. At this moment, we happen to be working on a national level with a number of states who are looking at how to open the aperture and to include more voices in the process. Unfortunately, states like Vermont, where I believe the battle lines have been drawn, it's almost impossible to have a conversation that serves the greater interest because people get caught in the crossfire. And I'm really disappointed with the way this process has unfolded so far. There was not a single word of testimony taken in the Senate on the bill that you are looking at right now. And there was a very narrow set of interests represented on the original version of the bill. I'm not going to get into some of the provisions other than issues around science-based wildlife management and what can happen. And I think it's important for the committee to recognize that other states have gone down this road in a number of different ways, and it has never led to success where narrow interests were being served. For example, in this bill, it gives the commissioner authority over wildlife management, which is tantamount to giving the governor jurisdiction over wildlife management, which I'm sure you've probably heard this is a complete politicizing of what should be a science-based process. States that have made executive decisions around wildlife management or have made political decisions around wildlife management have never been successful. I'm sure you've heard what happened in New Jersey when they closed the bear hunting season. That was an executive action. Instead of bears being viewed as these beautiful, majestic creatures, they instead were looked at more like giant rats raiding everybody's garbage cans, because the way we have changed completely the landscape of species, plants, and fish in parts of the country, hunters are an incredibly important part of the process for managing wildlife. Political decisions were made in California over wildlife management, and particularly around predator hunting, where we had encroached as humans into their habitat. And the hunting season was closed, and in the name of health and safety of humans, which I understand, the animals are still being controlled, the same numbers, but no hunters are involved, and at the expense of $7,000 per animal. States that changed the composition, Washington and Colorado, to allow what are non-hunting interest on the board, that was unapologetically led by anti-hunting and animal rights activists who were smart enough to buy their time and finally were able to get, because the appointments are political, as was called for in the provisions in the original bill introduced in the Senate, there is now a majority of animal rights activists on those boards and commissions and have shut down seasons for no scientific basis, including a season in Washington, Colorado, and other states as well. My point is that what you are considering is going to have consequences well beyond what you might imagine. And other states have gone through this. And I'm very conscious of the lesson that those who don't learn from history are doomed to repeat it. And there are examples that the committee really should be taking a hard look at. If I were an anti-hunting activist, I would be absolutely delighted with this bill because of how politics will now rule fish and wildlife management instead of science. And I find it ironic that a lot of the same folks who might believe in the science of climate change are somehow rejecting the science of peer-reviewed wildlife management. There's an opportunity for everybody to be involved and have a seat at the table for deciding how wildlife is managed. And I believe that as commissioner, the Fish and Wildlife Department staff are with the most conservation-minded folks I have ever met. And if there are deficiencies with how the process is managed, it is not the fault of the department. And I would also like to point out that in Vermont, the current Fish and Wildlife Board is simply a rule-making body. Other states have varied boards and commissions. Some set policy around fish and wildlife management, approve the fish and wildlife budget, hire and fire the director or commissioner of fish and wildlife. What was originally introduced and what has been discussed and considered is a template lifted from another state and put down in Vermont, even though there's really not a corollary to how this might be used in other states to effectively change policy. If there is a good conversation to be had around trapping, that should be taken up as a separate issue, or coyote hunting with hounds, or hunting with bear hounds. All issues that I am very aware have been concerns for a lot of people. But to take provisions that have really failed in other states and led to unintended consequences nobody imagined, and bundle them together with some other really important issues that are worthy of a conversation to serve the best interest of the most Vermonters, this is not it. And my fear is that the legacy of these bills will be a fundamental change in wildlife management. I do not have a tinfoil hat. This is not a conspiracy theory. It's pretty easy to look across the country at these exact same similar provisions and what has happened over time. I would strongly encourage the committee to step back and find a path forward that includes folks who are genuinely interested in sharing wildlife resources for all. I understand that is a value of the public trust doctrine, but I don't think it's a secret to anybody that the original impetus of this bill was pushed by animal rights activists who, managed to bide their time and leveraging similar policy provisions to fundamentally change the science of wildlife management. And I feel like we can do a lot better than this. And I understand that, there is political momentum to move this out and get behind this bill. But I feel pretty confident that we're all going to look back on this and wonder what the heck we've done, because we haven't considered what those unintended consequences would be of making a process political, changing the composition of boards and commissions in a way that isn't necessarily representing all interests, but becomes overly political to the point where you won't recognize what you thought might be happening and what will ultimately happen in the end. I understand that I am an added witness. You can see I pulled over on the side of the road because this is so incredibly important from Vermont landscape perspective, and how we manage and share wildlife. And, one of the things I love about where we live is the ability to collaborate and work together. And I feel as though this entire conversation has been completely co-opted by interests, some of whom get their information off of social media. And I also recognize that there is a historic relationship between hunting and angling community and the Fish and Wildlife Department, and that it's something that it's pretty hard to want to let go of. And to the degree that, people can be involved in a conversation about how to do this the right way, is something that I frankly would just expect that we are able to do in Vermont. 2 weeks ago, I was at a conference in Denver by some of the biggest funders in this space, specifically talking about how to manage wildlife in the future in a way that represents all interests, but does not have unintended consequences. And these are groups that I was the only person there that represented an organization that came from the quote unquote hunting and fishing community, although I your organization as being more of a conservation organization focused on public land and public wildlife. And people were very aware of what was happening in Vermont. And this was not a, hunting and fishing community, not a hunting and fishing gathering. These were folks that were coming at this from a landscape scale conservation perspective. Recognize that I was an add-on as a witness. I'd like to be conscious of time, but I would love to field questions or hear from the committee if there's interest.
Yeah, thanks for taking the time to join us from the road. Representative Stebbins.
Thanks. You've said a number of times that S258 that we're looking at right now would take away the science-based approach to managing wildlife. And I am really struggling to see that in this bill for two reasons. First of all, I mean, it says at the bottom of page 7, the rules shall be supported by, and the language was actually changed to even get more to your point. The rules shall be supported by the best science available through department and peer-reviewed research. So, I mean, there is articulation that actually it is meant to stay off, based on science-based approaches. There's that. There's also the fact that right now, the process is the Department of Fish and Wildlife staff, draft the regs and the rules and then bring it to the board, and the board ultimately approves, and then it comes to LCAR. I have experience in rulemaking procedures for building energy code before the Public Service Department, where there is no Fish and Wildlife Board. The Department of Public Service, looks at what is required per statute and the rulemaking requirements, opens up like a 1.5 to 2 year long, stakeholder process, takes all the feedback when there are differences of opinions. They try to sift through the middle so that by the time they go to ICAR, then LCAR, literally no one is in the room because everybody's like, yes, I understand these regs. So I struggle because I don't see the language here that's alluding to what you're saying, which is all of a sudden we would shift to like a non-science approach. And B, I actually, like, in my mind, the anomaly right now is this approach where we have a separate board that is approving it. And you're welcome to, that's an anomaly to me in my experience. So we would still have the Department of Fish and Wildlife drafting the regs. We would still be having the stakeholder process. I guess I don't see how, if you're still having the biologists write it, I'm not connecting the dots that it's no longer science-based.
First of all, and I appreciate that, right? Very fair question. Almost every state has a board or commission that is designed to separate politics from science. And in Vermont, you may not like the board, but it's at least set up with staggered 6-year terms where they cannot be reappointed and will very likely span multiple governors, which means that you've got a robust discussion among 14 people that only have one term and have been appointed by different governors, taking the politics out of that. Having worked in the Department of Fish and Wildlife, I demanded that the department follow the best available science. However, it is also not uncommon, depending on where you are and where you live, because the department is part of the executive branch, to find science that suits them. Now, in some places in the country, Fish and Wildlife departments under that executive jurisdiction and authority have ignored legislative prerogatives for things like including tribal leaders and indigenous voices out in parts of the West, or people of color, or in the case we're talking about, sound science. And I understand that if you follow the breadcrumbs from, the process that you're articulating to the end, it is still not at all immune to the politics and the whims of what can be suggested by the department. And working inside of state government, I can tell you that that's not a reach to think that there will be political recommendations, because I think we're all aware you can find the science that you need to in order to tell the story that you want to tell.
Okay, so to sum up, it is shifting it to executive branch, which may or may not have a different opinion. And so from your perspective, it's removing sort of a separate check and balance.
It is. And listen, there are ways to get at the idea of representing more interest through, you know, a multiple processes, rather than giving the authority to the executive branch without a separate body to adequately review that. And also, listen, there's tremendous value in having people who actually engage in that activities understand what it is that they're working on, what it is they're voting on, as opposed to pulling that away from that part of the process, which again is a pretty standard layer, safety net, if you will, of review in almost every single state. And then they'll have varying degrees of authority, jurisdiction, structure, composition, et cetera. But that's the reason why those boards and commissions exist.
Thanks.
Representative Bongartz.
Pat, this is Seth Bongartz, and you and I have talked a few times for an hour or so over the last few days. And I appreciate your thoughtful approach to this as well. I want to push back a little bit on one area, and that's that this is an agenda being driven by somebody else, because I think this committee, I will say, and I certainly, I'm thinking about this not because anybody's telling me to think about it. I'm thinking about it because it needs to be thought about, and I think that's true of the whole committee. So I do want to, I don't buy that we're doing this or this is happening because of somebody. I think some issues have been raised. The issue of control of pounds, for instance, was one that the legislature was frankly foisted on us because there were issues. And then, so I guess what I want to, put just to explore this a little bit, when you talk about, the process becoming political if it's, without a board. And yet we had, with this legislature passed a bill last year that, at least in my view, the board then, and there was some good work done, and I want to start with that, by the way. The work done on different kind of traps. If you're going to have trapping, whether you like it or not, the work that was done there was actually really good work. And we heard testimony about that at Elkhart. And yet, our concern about distance, what a trail was that I think there was a political response to that, and it was to make it so narrow that it actually ignored what the legislature was trying to do by its plain language. And we had the same issue with trapping, within, I know in some states it's a lot more than 50 feet, and the board even ignored the 50 feet. And then, trying to insert, like we've talked about, you and I talked about the notion that trapping is hunting. We can have that discussion, but that's one that ought to be brought to the legislature. So, in my view, I guess I have to say that I have found that process in the way that the legislature was ignored, at least in large measure by the board. I found that to be pretty political. And I, it sticks in my craw, frankly. But I do want to say that I appreciate your notion of trying to find a path forward where all, perspectives can be legitimized and recognized. And I guess I'll just close with that, saying I appreciate you bringing that to the discussion, just like the person before you did.
Yeah, and Representative Bongartz, I appreciate the frustration that must have been felt between, the notion of hunting is trapping, and along those lines. I mean, to me, we're in this interesting time in the history of wildlife management where I think there are going to be fits and starts to getting to this place where there's better understanding and acceptance of different viewpoints and the policies that we develop. I get all of that, right? My question is, what problem are you trying to solve? And are you taking a sledgehammer to something that requires a screwdriver? It feels to me as though we have waded into shark infested waters when we simply think we're going for a swim, not recognizing what those unintended consequences are. And Representative Stebbins, pretty much the same structure was set up in states where the executive branch used that authority to make political decisions about wildlife management. So if there's frustrations with conversations about trapping or hunting coyotes or hunting with hounds, like, let's have that conversation. Let's have that separate conversation. Let's have a conversation if this committee doesn't believe that hunting and trapping are the same thing. It feels as though we are just throwing stuff against the wall to see what sticks. And, assuming, look, Vermont has been a leader in so many ways and on so many things, starting with, renewable energy, from civil unions to gay marriage and on and on and on. This is not that, though. This has been tried. This did not work. This became a political process. And again, it feels like a sledgehammer to something that is part of growing pains as our society changes and we expand and open our aperture to others about how they view wildlife and how they value wildlife and how we can have that broader conversation, which is something that maybe I haven't always done well, but boy, I sure have tried in my career, including my time when I was commissioner. And I will tell you this, I made a huge effort to work with every single constituent group and find something that we could work on so that this became everybody's department. I elevated the non-game program equal to the game program. I raised in private money $3 million to purchase a piece of land for climate change adaptation, and on and on and on. I mean, that is where I'm coming from. And frankly, the idea of having the commissioner in charge of managing wildlife, regardless of whatever process is articulated, scares the heck out of me that we're not going to recognize in a few short years what fish and wildlife management should look like. And I'm not just urging, man, I'm begging this committee to take a step back and find the Vermont way to come up with these solutions. And just responding to your comment, Representative Bongartz, about interest driving this. The original bill has been something that has been driven by anti-hunting activists for a long time. I don't think they apologize for that. And the idea of giving authority over what fish and wildlife management to the executive branch is maybe the Senate, granted, there was no testimony taken on this at all, thought of this coincidentally on their own, but this has been another favorite policy tactic for folks who are, in the end, this is the best way to get rid of hunting or certain types of current legal hunting that falls within the jurisdiction of science-based management.
Right. Thank you again for joining us.
Thank you.
Right. Members, with that, we are going to adjourn. Morning.